Well, George Zimmerman faced charges in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. Two sides to this story. Martin's family says this is a hate crime and Zimmerman should be charged to the fullest extent of the law. But Zimmerman said, and his family say, he did nothing wrong. He was just standing his ground. There is a lot to talk about here, a lot to try and understand. Now that the special prosecutor has decided to not seek a grand jury, it is all up to her, Angela Corey, where this case goes. Eddie Suarez is a Tampa defense attorney. Good to see you. Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it very much. And help us understand some things. Did it surprise you that she decided to not send it to the grand jury?
A little bit, but I have to tell you, Russell, prosecutors every day make charging decisions without a grand jury. So this is a common practice. The surprise comes in that this is such a politically charged, such an emotional case that the grand jury would have afforded her a little bit of a buffer, presenting the evidence to a group of citizens to make a decision, and she decided to forego that.
That's not to say that she could not come back later and say, I do want a grand jury to hear this, right? She can make that decision.
She can, absolutely. At any time, she can make that decision. I mean, it's really up to her.
We've been reporting this morning that because it's not going to the grand jury, that first-degree murder charges are off the table then. Does this, in your mind, give any indication where she may be going with this?
A little bit. I think it is. That's right. First-degree charges are off the table. But I think if she was planning on not charging him with anything, she would have been more likely to use a grand jury and that way be able to turn back around and say to the community, look, we presented the evidence to citizens and they decided there's not enough here to file charges. So I think we can assume that she's leaning towards filing charges, and that's why she's not using the grand jury.
Wow. I hadn't even thought about it from that perspective. Interesting. You're a defense attorney. Let's take the emotions out of this. And given what you know, if charges are filed, is this a tough case to prove?
Yeah, I think it's a tough case to prove. There's a lot that is unknown and unknowable. What happened in those few minutes where only Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman are involved? And I think George Zimmerman has presented a reasonable scenario of how things unfolded, and I think it would be difficult for the prosecution.
We had a little time to talk before the segment started, and I asked you if you had ever used Stand Your Ground. You said you've used it a couple of times.
Right, I have.
And it helped? It worked?
Absolutely. I think if the evidence is consistent with the notion that the defendant was in danger, that the danger was reasonable, and that he acted in self-defense. I think in one of the two cases I had, the judge dismissed the charges.
What did you do as a defense attorney prior to Stand Your Ground, before you had that to work with?
Okay. Well, prior to Stand Your Ground, the jury got to make the decision of whether or not the defendant had whether it was an appropriate use of self-defense or not, as a general rule. And secondly, a citizen had to retreat. The defendant had a duty to retreat before he could use deadly force. So whether or not you had the option of using deadly force, you first had to evaluate whether you could remove yourself from that situation. Stand Your Ground changes that. Now, you no longer have a duty to retreat. If you are attacked or you're in fear for your life, you can use deadly force without having to first determine whether or not you can retreat safely.
There's talk of the legislature revisiting Stand Your Ground. You think it's a good idea?
I do think it's a good idea. I think there's two issues about Stand Your Ground that are problematic. First is this immunity component, where before you could charge somebody, the prosecution and police have to determine whether immunity applies. That's a big burden on the system, on law enforcement and on prosecutors. Secondly, I think it's a value judgment that we have to make. As a society, if you can remove yourself from danger safely rather than taking a life, should you do that first, as opposed to shooting to defend yourself or taking some violent action to defend yourself? You know, the reality is self-defense worked. It was an effective legal concept that had been in place for hundreds of years. And we just tweaked it, 7 years ago. Right. And look at the mess we've created.
Let's leave it right there. You're going to join us again at 9 o'clock. Eddie Suarez, thank you. As always, good to see you.